I've been investigating missing persons cases for over 2 decades, but nothing prepared me for what I discovered about the Monroe family. 29 years have passed since I first opened their file, and even now, as I write this account, my hands shake when I remember what we found beneath the ice at Thorpe Lake. This isn't just another cold case story. This is something that changed my understanding of what's possible in our world, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the spaces between them. It was March 15th, 1994, when David Monroe, his wife Sarah, and their twin daughters Emma and Sophie, aged 12, packed their dark blue Ford Explorer for what should have been a week-long spring break adventure in Alaska. I've studied every detail of their lives leading up to that trip, interviewed everyone who knew them, reconstructed their final days with the precision of an archaeologist examining ancient ruins. They were the kind of family that appeared in suburban dreams. Stable, loving, unremarkable in the best possible way. David Monroe was 38 years old, a software engineer for Boeing in Seattle. His colleagues described him as methodical and careful, the type of man who read instruction manuals cover to cover and always packed emergency supplies. He'd grown up in Minnesota, the son of a Lutheran minister, and carried that Midwest practicality with him wherever he went. Sarah was 36, a third-grade teacher at Riverview Elementary, known for her patient nature and the way she could calm even the most anxious child. She kept detailed journals of everything: family vacations, the girls' achievements, even grocery lists written in her careful, rounded handwriting. The twins, Emma and Sophie, were 12 years old and identical in appearance, but opposite in temperament. Emma was the adventurous one, always asking questions, collecting rocks and insects, documenting everything with the camera she'd received for Christmas. She wanted to be a photojournalist when she grew up, to travel the world and show people places they'd never seen. Sophie was quieter, artistic, carrying her sketchbook everywhere and filling page after page with detailed drawings of flowers, animals, and landscapes. She had a gift for capturing not just what things looked like, but how they felt. They'd planned this Alaska trip for over a year, saving money and researching locations. David's college roommate, Marcus Brennan, had inherited a remote cabin near Denali National Park from his grandfather, and he'd been inviting the Monroes to visit for years. The cabin sat on the edge of Thorpe Lake, surrounded by dense pine forests and mountains that seemed to touch the sky. It was the kind of place where silence had weight, where the modern world felt like a distant memory, where a family could truly disconnect from everything and just be together. I've been to that cabin many times over the years, studying every inch of the property, trying to understand what happened there. The structure itself was built in 1947 by Theodore Brennan, Marcus's grandfather, a former logger who decided to homestead in the Alaskan wilderness after returning from World War II. Theodore had chosen the location carefully, positioning the cabin on a slight rise that provided views of the lake, while keeping it sheltered from the harsh winds that swept down from the mountains. The building was solid, constructed from local timber, with a stone foundation that went deep into the permafrost. The cabin featured 2 bedrooms, a main living area with a massive stone fireplace, and a kitchen equipped with propane appliances. There was no electricity from the grid, just a diesel generator that provided power for lights and a few modern conveniences. The water came from a well that Theodore had dug himself, tapping into an underground spring that never froze, even in the depths of winter. The nearest neighbor was 53 miles away, and the closest town, Clearwater, was a 3-hour drive on winding mountain roads that became treacherous during storms. Theodore Brennan had lived in that cabin alone for nearly 30 years before his own mysterious disappearance in 1976. According to local records, he'd driven into Clearwater for supplies in early December and simply never returned. His truck was found abandoned on a back road, keys in the ignition, groceries still in the back seat. Search teams found no trace of him, despite extensive efforts that continued through the following spring. The case was eventually closed, chalked up to another victim of Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. Marcus inherited the property when his father passed away in 1990, but he'd only visited a handful of times, preferring to rent it out to tourists looking for an authentic wilderness experience. When I spoke with Marcus years later, he remembered David calling him in February of 1994, excited about bringing his family to experience real Alaskan wilderness. Dave was like a kid planning that trip, Marcus told me, sitting in his Seattle office, looking out at the city skyline. He said the girls had never seen snow like that, never experienced real silence. Sarah was worried about being so isolated, especially with no cell phone coverage, but Dave convinced her it would be an adventure. He said they needed time away from everything, just the four of them, no distractions. The family had planned their activities meticulously. David wanted to teach the girls ice fishing, something he'd learned as a boy growing up on Minnesota lakes. Sarah looked forward to reading by the fireplace and writing in her journal, documenting their adventure for future memories. Emma was excited about photographing wildlife and landscapes she'd only seen in National Geographic magazines. Sophie wanted to sketch the mountains and maybe spot some of the aurora borealis that was common in that region during March. They'd driven up on Friday, March 11th, taking the scenic route through Anchorage, stopping at tourist spots along the way. I've traced their route using credit card receipts and interviews with people who remembered them. They stopped at the Anchorage Museum, where Emma took dozens of photos of the Alaska Native exhibits. They had lunch at a diner called Moose's Tooth, where the waitress remembered Sophie sketching on napkins while they waited for their food. They bought supplies at a sporting goods store, purchasing additional warm clothing and emergency flares. David's cautious nature ensuring they were prepared for any situation. The drive to the cabin took them through some of the most beautiful and isolated country in North America. The road wound through valleys carved by glaciers, past frozen waterfalls that hung like crystal curtains from rock faces, through forests so dense that the trees blocked out most of the sky. Emma documented everything with her camera, taking pictures through the car windows, asking David to stop whenever she saw something particularly interesting. Sophie filled several pages of her sketchbook with quick drawings of the landscapes they passed, capturing the essence of the wilderness in simple, elegant lines. They arrived at the cabin just as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. According to Sarah's journal, which I've read hundreds of times, the girls were immediately enchanted by the place. Emma ran straight to the lake, Sarah wrote that first night. She wanted to test the ice, see if it was thick enough to walk on. Sophie stood on the porch, just staring at the mountains, like she was trying to memorize them. David was already planning our fishing expedition for tomorrow. I've never seen him so relaxed, so happy to be away from the city. That first evening passed peacefully. They unpacked their belongings, started a fire in the stone fireplace, and cooked dinner on the propane stove. Sarah's journal describes a perfect family night. David reading aloud from a Jack London story. Emma organizing her camera equipment for the next day's adventures. Sophie sketching the interior of the cabin by lamplight. They went to bed early, tired from the long drive but excited about the week ahead. Saturday brought clear skies and temperatures hovering around 10 degrees below zero. David and the girls bundled up in their new winter gear and headed out to explore the property while Sarah stayed inside to write and plan their meals. They spent the morning testing the ice thickness on Thorpe Lake, finding it solid enough to support their weight even near the shore. David showed the girls how to identify the best spots for ice fishing, explaining how fish behavior changed in winter, how to read the underwater landscape through the frozen surface. Emma took photograph after photograph, documenting everything from the way frost formed on pine needles to the patterns wind made in the snow. Sophie sketched constantly, her pencils working quickly across the pages despite the cold. According to Sarah's journal, they came back for lunch, glowing with excitement, talking over each other as they described what they'd seen, planning the afternoon's activities. It was that afternoon when they first noticed something unusual about the lake. David was setting up their ice fishing equipment when Emma called out that she could see something moving beneath the ice. When the family gathered to look, they observed dark shapes shifting in the water below, too large to be fish, moving with purpose rather than the random motion of aquatic life. David said it was probably just shadows from the clouds, Sarah wrote. But the sky was clear, and the shapes seemed to be following us as we moved along the shore. Sophie made several sketches of what she saw, and those drawings were among the items found in the cabin after the family disappeared. I've studied them extensively, trying to understand what a 12-year-old girl might have been seeing beneath that ice. The sketches show elongated forms, roughly human-sized, with appendages that could be arms or tentacles. Most disturbing are the details Sophie added around what might be faces, multiple eyes, or perhaps just hollow spaces where eyes should be. That evening, the family's routine was disrupted by sounds coming from the lake. Sarah's journal entry for Saturday night describes noises that began just after dark. It sounds like knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone tapping on wood, but it's coming from under the ice. David went out with a flashlight to investigate, but the sounds stopped as soon as he stepped outside. They started again when he came back in. The girls are frightened, and I have to admit, so am I. Sunday morning brought fresh snow and a sense of unease that permeated Sarah's writing. The family had planned to hike one of the nearby trails, but the weather had turned, with heavy clouds building over the mountains and wind picking up from the north. They spent most of the day inside, playing board games and reading, but the mood had changed. Emma's photographs from that day show the family looking tense, their smiles forced, and their eyes constantly drifting toward the windows that faced the lake. It was Sunday night when everything changed. Sarah's final journal entry, the one that still gives me chills when I read it, describes the family being awakened around 2 a.m. by sounds unlike anything they'd heard before. "It's not just knocking now," she wrote. "It's voices, multiple voices calling from beneath the ice. They sound like children, like little girls, singing nursery rhymes. But the words are wrong, twisted somehow. Emma wants to go out and investigate. She says the voices are calling her name. Midun." The last paragraph of Sarah's entry, written in her careful handwriting, describes the family's decision to stay inside until morning, to leave first thing, and cut their vacation short. But below that, in different handwriting that looked rushed and shaky, someone had added, "Don't go outside after dark. It knows we're here." Ndind. The writing was analyzed by multiple handwriting experts over the years, and while it didn't match samples from any family member, fear and stress can dramatically alter someone's writing style. Monday morning, March 14th, was the last time anyone outside the family had any contact with them. David was supposed to call his supervisor at Boeing that morning to confirm his return date and discuss an important presentation scheduled for the following week. David Monroe was obsessively punctual and had never missed a work deadline in his 15 years with the company. When that call didn't come, his supervisor, Janet Murphy, assumed David was having phone troubles at the remote location and decided to wait until Tuesday before worrying. The first sign something was wrong came Friday, March 18th, when David failed to show up for the presentation he was supposed to lead. Janet immediately called Sarah's sister Linda, who lived in Tacoma and was the family's emergency contact. Linda tried calling the cabin's landline repeatedly throughout the day, but there was no answer. Growing increasingly worried, she contacted Marcus Brennan, who agreed to drive up to the cabin immediately and check on his friends. Marcus made that 3-hour drive through winding mountain roads, arriving at Thorpe Lake just as the sun was setting. What he found there still haunts him today. The scene appeared normal at first glance. The dark blue Ford Explorer was parked exactly where David would have left it, positioned carefully under the shelter of tall pines to protect it from falling snow. The keys were in the ignition, as was common in such remote locations where theft wasn't a concern. The family's luggage was still neatly arranged in the back, suggesting they hadn't begun packing for departure. Inside the cabin, everything appeared orderly, Sarah's organizational touch evident in every room. The beds were made with military precision. Dishes were cleaned and put away in the cupboards, and personal items were arranged neatly on dressers and nightstands. The fire in the stone fireplace had burned down to cold ashes, probably days old, based on their appearance. The diesel generator was turned off, though it had enough fuel to run for several more weeks. What troubled Marcus most was the unnatural stillness of the place. In his previous visits to the cabin, there had always been signs of life. Boots by the door, coats hung on hooks, magazines left open, coffee cups sitting on tables. Now everything was too perfect, too clean, as if the family had spent their final hours methodically organizing their belongings before simply vanishing into the wilderness. The most disturbing discovery was what Marcus found on the kitchen table. Sarah's journal, open to an entry dated Sunday, March 13th, 3 days into their stay. Her last words, written in her characteristic careful script, were haunting. The girls heard something moving under the ice last night. David says it's just the lake settling, but I've never heard sounds like that. We're going to investigate this morning. Below that, in the different handwriting that had appeared in previous entries, were the words, "They're calling us now, they want us to come down." Marcus immediately called the Alaska State Troopers from the cabin's landline, reporting the family missing and requesting an immediate search and rescue operation. The lead investigator assigned to the case was Detective Ray Coleman, a 20-year veteran of wilderness disappearances who'd seen every kind of tragedy the Alaskan wilderness could produce. When he arrived at the cabin the following morning with a full search team, he knew immediately that this wasn't a typical missing persons case. Detective Coleman was experienced with the patterns of wilderness disappearances. Lost hikers usually left obvious trails, abandoned campsites, scattered equipment, footprints leading in wrong directions. Families who encountered bears or other wildlife left signs of struggle, torn clothing, disturbed campsites. People who fell through ice left broken sections and obvious entry points. The Monroe scene showed none of these typical indicators. Families don't just vanish from locked cabins, Coleman told me years later when I interviewed him for this investigation. We were sitting in his retirement home in Fairbanks, and his eyes still carried the weight of unsolved cases. Especially not careful people like the Monroes. David was the type who would have left notes, made contingency plans, prepared for any emergency. Sarah kept track of everything. The girls were smart, responsible kids, for all 4 of them to disappear without leaving any trace. It defied everything I knew about human behavior. The search began immediately, with helicopters scanning the frozen lake and surrounding forests. Alaska search and rescue teams combed every trail, every ravine, every possible route the family might have taken. They found nothing. No footprints in the snow, despite the family having been there for several days. No torn clothing snagged on branches. No signs of struggle around the cabin. No abandoned equipment or personal items dropped during a hasty departure. The search expanded to include specialized teams with ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging equipment, and cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains, even under snow and ice. The dogs became agitated near the lake, barking and whining in a way their handlers had never seen before. Some refused to go onto the ice at all, despite being specifically trained for winter search operations. The thermal imaging equipment detected no human-sized heat signatures anywhere in the immediate area. Investigation revealed several puzzling details that made the disappearance even more mysterious. The family's heavy winter coats were still hanging by the door, despite sub-zero temperatures that would have been fatal within minutes for anyone venturing outside without proper protection. All 4 sets of snow boots remained lined up neatly in the entryway, as if the family had somehow left the cabin without putting them on. Emma's camera was missing from her luggage, but the battery charger remained plugged into the wall, suggesting she hadn't planned an extended photography expedition. Sophie's sketchbook was found under her bed, filled with drawings of the lake and surrounding landscape, but the final dozen pages had been carefully torn out. The remaining pages showed a progression from normal wilderness scenes to increasingly disturbing images. The lake, with dark shapes moving beneath the surface, the cabin surrounded by shadowy figures, and finally, detailed drawings of underwater landscapes that a 12-year-old girl should never have been able to imagine. Most puzzling was the condition of the ice on Thorpe Lake itself. When investigators examined it closely, they discovered what appeared to be a large hole, perfectly circular and approximately 6 feet in diameter, that had been recently refrozen. The ice around this area was significantly thinner than it should have been, and there were strange marks visible through the cloudy surface, like something large had moved beneath the water before the surface froze again. The hole itself defied explanation. The edges were too smooth to have been broken naturally, and the circular shape suggested it had been created deliberately. Ice fishing holes were typically much smaller and showed obvious tool marks from the augers used to create them. This hole looked almost melted rather than cut, as if something warm had risen from the depths and burned through the frozen surface. Local authorities expanded the search radius to 50 miles, bringing in cadaver dogs from Anchorage and specialized underwater equipment capable of searching beneath the ice. The dogs became increasingly agitated as they approached the lake, and their behavior was so unusual that several handlers recommended ending that particular search method. When divers attempted to explore beneath the ice near the mysterious hole, their equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, and they reported seeing shapes moving in the deeper water that didn't appear on their sonar readings. The FBI was called in after a week, treating the case as a potential kidnapping despite the lack of any ransom demands or evidence of outside involvement. Federal agents investigated David's work at Boeing, wondering if his access to sensitive projects might have made him a target for industrial espionage or foreign agents. They found nothing suspicious. They examined Sarah's background, her students' families, any possible connection to criminal activity. Again, nothing. The family's finances were scrutinized for signs of debt problems or gambling issues that might have led to desperate measures. The Monroes were financially stable, with modest savings and no significant debts beyond their mortgage. They had no known enemies, no bitter divorces or custody battles in their past, no business disputes or legal problems. They were exactly what they appeared to be, an ordinary American family who had simply vanished without explanation. The case made national news briefly, with stories appearing on CNN and the major networks about the mysterious disappearance of a family from their remote vacation cabin. But without dramatic developments or clear evidence of foul play, media attention faded quickly. The story became another footnote in the long list of people who had vanished in Alaska's vast wilderness, joining the thousands who had walked into the wild and never returned. I first encountered the Monroe case in late 1996, nearly 3 years after their disappearance, when I was researching material for a book about unsolved cases in remote locations. At the time, I was working as a freelance journalist, specializing in missing persons investigations, drawn to cases that seemed to defy logical explanation. The Monroe file was remarkably thin for such a mysterious disappearance, filled mostly with search reports and witness statements that led nowhere. What initially caught my attention was Sarah's journal, which I was able to read through a Freedom of Information request. Her entries painted a picture of a loving family enjoying a wilderness adventure, but the final entries revealed an escalating sense of unease that culminated in something that clearly terrified them. The handwriting changes in those last entries bothered me most. Someone had been adding to Sarah's journal, someone who knew the family was in danger but couldn't or wouldn't identify the threat clearly. When I contacted Detective Coleman about the case, he was immediately willing to discuss it, despite the ongoing investigation. "I've worked hundreds of missing persons cases," he told me during our first phone conversation. "People disappear in Alaska for all kinds of reasons. They get lost, they fall through ice, they encounter wildlife, they have accidents in remote places where help can't reach them. But the Monroes, they didn't just disappear. It was like they were erased, and that hole in the lake, those marks under the ice, in 30 years of police work, I'd never seen anything like it." I made my first trip to Thorpe Lake in the spring of 1997, driving the same route the Monroe family had taken 3 years earlier. The cabin had been sold to new owners who knew nothing of its history, and they were surprisingly willing to let me examine the property and interview them about their experiences living there. What they told me added another layer of mystery to an already inexplicable case. The new owners, Bob and Margaret Hartley from Oregon, had purchased the cabin as a retirement retreat, planning to spend summers there fishing and enjoying the wilderness. But their experiences had been troubling from the beginning. Electronic devices failed regularly near the lake. Cameras, radios, GPS units all malfunctioned without explanation. The generator required constant repairs despite being relatively new. Most disturbing were the sounds they heard at night, knocking from beneath the ice, even during summer months when the lake was completely thawed. "We've heard voices," Margaret told me, sitting on the cabin's porch and staring out at the lake. "Children's voices, singing songs we can't quite make out. They seem to come from the water, but when we go to investigate, everything goes quiet. Bob thinks it's just the acoustics of the lake, sound carrying from other campers, but the nearest neighbors are 50 miles away." The Hartleys had also discovered items that the police search had missed. While cleaning out a storage shed behind the cabin, they found Emma's missing camera hidden beneath a tarp and covered with a thick layer of dust. When they developed the film, the photographs told a story that the official investigation had never uncovered. The final roll of film contained images that should have been impossible. The early photos showed the family's normal vacation activities: Emma and Sophie playing in the snow, David setting up fishing equipment, Sarah reading by the fireplace. But the later images revealed something disturbing. Several photographs appeared to have been taken underwater, despite the fact that Emma's camera wasn't waterproof and the lake was frozen solid during their visit. These underwater images showed the Monroe family sinking beneath the surface of Thorpe Lake, but their expressions weren't those of drowning victims. They appeared calm, almost peaceful, as if they were choosing to descend into the dark water. Most disturbing was the final photograph on the roll, a group shot of all 4 family members sitting on the lake bottom, surrounded by murky water, their eyes open and looking directly at the camera. In the background, barely visible in the gloom, were other shapes that looked almost human, but somehow wrong. I took the camera and film to several expert photographers and forensic specialists, hoping to determine if the images had been manipulated or created through double exposure. Every expert I consulted confirmed that the photographs were genuine, taken with Emma's camera on the film that was loaded when the family disappeared. The underwater shots showed water pressure distortion and light refraction patterns that would have been impossible to fake with 1994 technology. The discovery of these photographs changed my understanding of the Monroe disappearance entirely. This wasn't a case of a family getting lost in the wilderness or encountering a tragic accident. Something had drawn them into the lake, and they had gone willingly, even bringing a camera to document their descent into whatever waited beneath the ice. I began researching the history of Thorpe Lake itself, diving into geological surveys, Native American oral traditions, and historical records of the area. What I discovered painted a picture of a place that had always been considered dangerous, even by people who lived their entire lives in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. The lake was formed approximately 12,000 years ago during the last ice age, carved by glacial action that left it unusually deep for its surface area. At its deepest point, Thorpe Lake reached nearly 300 feet down, far deeper than most mountain lakes. The bottom was covered with sediment so fine and thick that sonar readings often couldn't penetrate to the actual floor. Underground springs fed the lake from artesian wells that prevented it from freezing completely, even during the harshest winters. Local Native American tribes, specifically the Tanana people who had lived in the region for thousands of years, had their own stories about the lake. According to oral traditions I was able to record from tribal elders, Thorpe Lake was considered a place where the spirits of the drowned lingered, unable to find peace. The tribes had names for the lake that translated roughly to the place where voices call, or water that remembers. These stories spoke of families who had camped near the lake and heard the voices of deceased relatives calling to them from beneath the surface. According to legend, those who listened too long to these voices would eventually be compelled to join them in the underwater realm. The tribal elders I spoke with weren't surprised by the Monroe disappearance. "The lake has been hungry for a long time," one elderly woman told me. "It calls to those who are far from home, who miss their loved ones. It promises reunion, but the price is everything." I also researched Theodore Brennan's 1976 disappearance, looking for patterns that might connect his fate to that of the Monroe family. Theodore had lived alone at the cabin for nearly 30 years, and local records suggested he had become increasingly isolated and eccentric during his final years. Store clerks in Clearwater remembered him talking about voices from the lake, about family members who visited him at night, despite being long dead. Theodore's abandoned truck was found with groceries still in the back seat, but those groceries included items that seemed strange for a man living alone. Children's cereal, small-sized winter clothing, toys appropriate for young girls. When investigators had questioned him about these purchases during the initial search, clerks reported that Theodore claimed he was expecting company, but couldn't or wouldn't explain who might be coming to visit him in such a remote location. The parallels between Theodore's behavior and the Monroe family's final journal entries were unsettling. Both had mentioned hearing voices from the lake. Both had seemed to be preparing for some kind of encounter or visitor. Both had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a sense that something unnatural had occurred. As my investigation continued through 1997 and 1998, I began to collect reports of other unusual incidents around Thorpe Lake. Park rangers documented multiple cases of hikers and campers reporting strange phenomena, voices calling from the water, electronic equipment failures, and sightings of figures moving beneath the lake's surface. Several families had cut their vacations short after experiencing unexplained disturbances near the lake. Most of these reports were dismissed as typical wilderness anxiety, or the effects of isolation on urban dwellers unaccustomed to the profound silence of remote locations. But the consistency of the reports was striking. People described the same types of voices, the same equipment failures, the same sense of being watched from beneath the water. When I mapped these incidents, they all occurred within a 2-mile radius of the spot where the Monroe family had disappeared. The years passed, and the Monroe case grew cold in official records. Detective Coleman retired in 1999. The file was stored away with hundreds of other unsolved cases, and the cabin changed hands twice more as new owners discovered they couldn't tolerate the strange phenomena that plagued the property. Clearwater residents occasionally mentioned the missing family, but mostly the story faded into local folklore, another ghost story told around campfires. Some claimed to see lights moving under the ice on winter nights, pulsing in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code. Others reported strange sounds coming from the lake during summer months, like voices calling in languages they couldn't understand. The phenomenon became known locally as the Monroe Calls, and it was considered bad luck to spend more than one night camped near the lake. By 2002, I had moved on to other investigations, though I continued to monitor the Monroe case for any new developments. I had written extensively about their disappearance, but without new evidence, there was little more to be discovered through conventional investigation methods. The case had given me everything it was going to give, or so I thought. Everything changed on March 15th, 2003, exactly 9 years after the Monroe family's disappearance. I was working on a completely different case in Colorado when I received a phone call that brought me immediately back to Alaska. The caller was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a geologist working for Arctic Survey Solutions, a company contracted by the federal government to monitor permafrost changes and glacial movement throughout Alaska. Dr. Walsh was calling about satellite imagery her team had captured of Thorpe Lake during their routine survey work. What they had discovered defied every scientific explanation she could offer, and she had contacted me because my articles about the Monroe case were among the first results that appeared when she researched the lake online. "I need you to see this data before I report it to federal authorities," she told me during that initial phone call. "I've been analyzing satellite thermal imaging for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what's happening at Thorpe Lake. There's movement beneath the surface, organized movement, and the thermal signatures they're human. Multiple human signatures, maintaining body temperature, moving in coordinated patterns for 9 years. The implications of what Dr. Walsh was telling me were staggering. If her data was accurate, it suggested that something human-sized had been alive beneath Thorpe Lake since the time of the Monroe disappearance, surviving in water that should have been fatal within minutes during an Alaskan winter. I flew to Anchorage the next day and drove immediately to Arctic Survey Solutions field office, where Dr. Walsh showed me satellite imagery that challenged everything I thought I knew about the Monroe case. The thermal readings showed 5 distinct heat signatures moving beneath the lake's surface, roughly human-sized and maintaining a consistent temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, normal human body temperature. The movement patterns were what made the data truly extraordinary. The signatures moved in formation, staying close together, following the same circular route around the lake's perimeter every 12 hours. The movement occurred only at night, beginning exactly at sunset and ending at dawn. During daylight hours, the signatures remained stationary in the deepest part of the lake, approximately 40 feet down, clustered together as if resting or sleeping. "We've been monitoring this location for 3 months, Dr. Walsh explained, showing me weeks of data that displayed the same pattern repeating endlessly. The consistency is unlike anything in nature. These signatures appear and begin moving at the exact moment the sun sets each day, regardless of weather conditions or seasonal changes. They follow the same route at the same depth every single night. During the day, they cluster in one location and remain motionless for exactly 12 hours. The thermal imaging technology was sophisticated enough to distinguish between different heat sources, animals, geological features, human bodies. The signatures beneath Thorpe Lake were definitively human-sized and human temperature, but they were moving underwater in a way that should have been impossible for living people. Dr. Walsh had initially assumed the readings were false positives, equipment malfunctions that were creating phantom images in the data. But after 3 months of identical readings from multiple satellite passes and ground-based thermal sensors, she was forced to conclude that something was actually there, something that defied rational explanation. "I've had engineers check every component of our equipment," she told me. "I've compared our readings with data from other satellites, other sensors. Everything confirms the same impossible conclusion. There are 5 human-sized objects moving beneath that lake, maintaining body temperature, following organized patterns for hours every night. They've been doing this for as long as we've been monitoring the location." When I asked if 5 was significant, Dr. Walsh's expression grew somber. 5 signatures. The Monroe family had 4 members, and you mentioned in your articles that the previous cabin owner, Theodore Brennan, also disappeared near the lake. That's 5 people total. The satellite data suggested that somehow, impossibly, the Monroe family and Theodore Brennan were still beneath Thorpe Lake, alive in some form, moving in nightly patterns that had continued for 9 years. The implications were so extraordinary that Dr. Walsh had delayed reporting her findings, hoping to discover some conventional explanation for what her equipment was detecting. I spent the next 3 days reviewing every piece of data Dr. Walsh's team had collected, looking for alternative explanations that didn't require accepting the impossible. Could the signatures be large fish that had somehow adapted to the cold water? The movement patterns were too organized, too purposeful. Could they be geological features that were somehow generating heat? Geological processes didn't maintain precise human body temperature or move in coordinated formations. Could the readings be equipment errors or atmospheric interference? Dr. Walsh's team had considered every possibility and ruled out technical explanations. Multiple independent systems were detecting the same signatures, and the consistency of the data over months ruled out random malfunctions. The only explanation that fit the evidence was the one that challenged everything we understood about human survival in extreme conditions. The Monroe family and Theodore Brennan were somehow still alive beneath the frozen surface of Thorpe Lake, existing in a state that defied medical and scientific understanding. Dr. Walsh and I contacted Detective Coleman, who had retired but remained interested in the case that had haunted him for nearly a decade. When we showed him the satellite data, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "I knew we'd missed something," he said, studying the thermal images with the intensity of a man who had spent years wondering what happened to a missing family. 9 years, and they were right there the whole time. But how? How is this possible? The decision was made to organize a recovery operation using specialized equipment designed for underwater rescue in extreme conditions. The state of Alaska, the FBI, and several federal agencies became involved, classifying the operation under emergency search and rescue protocols. The level of secrecy surrounding the operation suggested that officials were preparing for discoveries that they couldn't explain to the public. The recovery team arrived at Thorpe Lake on March 20th, 5 days after Dr. Walsh's initial discovery, bringing equipment that included underwater cameras, diving bells capable of operation in near-freezing water, and emergency medical facilities to treat whatever they might find beneath the ice. The operation was led by Dr. Michael Santos, a specialist in underwater rescue who had supervised similar operations in the Arctic Ocean. I was permitted to observe the operation as a consultant, given my years of research into the Monroe disappearance and my relationship with Dr. Walsh's team. What I witnessed during the next 48 hours changed my understanding of what's possible in our world, and it still haunts my dreams nearly 2 decades later. The drilling began at dawn on March 20th, using specialized equipment designed to penetrate ice while maintaining the integrity of whatever lay beneath. As the drill broke through the surface layer, water bubbled up that was dark and thick, carrying with it a smell that made seasoned investigators cover their faces. The water was warm, despite the sub-zero air temperature, and it moved with a sluggish consistency that was unlike normal lake water. Dr. Santos deployed underwater cameras immediately, lowering them through the hole on cable systems that allowed real-time viewing of whatever lay beneath the surface. What the cameras revealed defied every expectation we had formed based on the satellite data. At the bottom of Thorpe Lake, perfectly preserved in the dark water, sat 5 human figures arranged in a precise circle. 4 of them were clearly identifiable as the Monroe family, virtually unchanged from their 1994 disappearance. David, Sarah, Emma, and Sophie sat cross-legged on the lake bottom, holding hands, their eyes closed as if sleeping peacefully. The 5th figure, an elderly man wearing clothes from the 1970s, was clearly Theodore Brennan, completing the circle by holding Sophie's hand on one side and David's on the other. But they weren't dead, at least not in any conventional sense. As we watched through the underwater cameras, the figures swayed gently in the current, their hair and clothing moving naturally as if they were breathing underwater. Most impossibly, their skin appeared normal, unmarked by 9 years of submersion in water that should have destroyed human tissue within days. "This is medically impossible," Dr. Santos told the assembled team as we watched the impossible scene on our monitors. "Human beings cannot survive submersion for more than a few minutes, let alone years. The pressure alone at that depth should have crushed them. The cold should have killed them within the first hour. And yet, as we watched, Emma Monroe opened her eyes and looked directly at the camera. Her gaze was clear and alert, showing no signs of the degradation that should have occurred after 9 years underwater. She smiled, an expression that was both peaceful and deeply unsettling, and raised her free hand to wave at the camera before closing her eyes again. The medical team immediately began preparing for emergency extraction, despite the inexplicable nature of what they were seeing. If the Monroe family was somehow still alive after 9 years underwater, they needed immediate medical attention to have any chance of survival on the surface. Dr. Santos deployed divers in specialized suits designed for extreme cold water rescue operations. The divers descended through the dark water, their lights creating an eerie glow that illuminated the impossible scene at the lake bottom. As they approached the circle of figures, several extraordinary things became apparent through their helmet cameras. The water around the Monroe family was significantly warmer than the surrounding lake water, as if they were generating heat somehow. The lake bottom beneath them was covered with objects that shouldn't have been there. Personal belongings, photographs, items of clothing that appeared to span decades. Most disturbing was the discovery that Emma's camera was still clutched in her hand, apparently functional despite 9 years of submersion. When the divers attempted to examine it more closely, Emma's eyes opened again, and she shook her head slightly, as if refusing to let them take the camera. The movement was deliberate and conscious, indicating awareness despite her impossible circumstances. The divers attached lifting cables to each family member, preparing to bring them to the surface simultaneously to avoid separating them after so many years together. But as they began to ascend, the warm water around the family became turbulent, and the temperature readings from the divers' equipment showed rapid fluctuations that suggested some kind of environmental resistance to their removal. When the Monroe family reached the surface, something extraordinary and terrifying occurred. The moment they left the water and were exposed to air, their bodies began to change rapidly. Their skin, which had appeared normal underwater, became translucent, showing veins and internal structures that should not have been visible. Their breathing, which had somehow functioned underwater, became labored and desperate as their lungs tried to process air instead of water. "They're dying," Dr. Santos announced, watching vital signs that fluctuated wildly as the family was moved to the emergency medical facility that had been set up on shore. "Whatever was keeping them alive down there, they can't survive up here." The medical team worked frantically to stabilize the family, but their vital signs continued to deteriorate rapidly. David's heart rate dropped to levels incompatible with consciousness. Sarah's breathing became irregular and then stopped entirely, though she remained somehow alert and aware. The twins began to convulse as their nervous systems struggled to adapt to an environment they hadn't experienced for 9 years. Most heartbreaking was their awareness of what was happening to them. Despite their physical deterioration, the Monroe family remained conscious and able to communicate. Sarah looked at the medical team working on her and whispered, "We have to go back." "We can't stay up here anymore," Emma managed to say. "The water keeps us together. Up here we come apart." Theodore Brennan, who had been underwater for 27 years, deteriorated fastest of all. Within minutes of being brought to the surface, his body began to crumble like paper that had been soaked too long. But before he completely dissolved, he managed to speak a few words that chilled everyone who heard them. The lake chooses who stays. The lake chooses who feeds it. We volunteered, but others it takes. The Monroe family lasted 6 hours on the surface before their bodies completely dissolved, leaving behind only their clothing and Emma's camera. Dr. Santos and his medical team were unable to explain what they had witnessed or how the family had survived underwater for so long. The official medical report listed the cause of death as drowning, with the time of death recorded as 9 years prior, despite clear evidence that they had been alive and conscious when brought to the surface. Emma's camera, the one she had clutched throughout 9 years underwater, was found to contain film that had somehow remained intact and developable. When processed, the final photographs revealed images that documented the family's underwater existence. Pictures of the lake bottom that showed structures that shouldn't have existed, formations that looked like buildings or cities adapted for underwater life. The photos showed other figures in the background, people who appeared to have been living beneath the lake for much longer than the Monroe family. The final image on the roll was a group photograph that included dozens of people arranged in concentric circles around the Monroe family. Men, women, and children of all ages, all appearing peaceful and content despite their impossible underwater existence. At the edge of the frame, barely visible, was a structure that looked like a house or cabin, perfectly preserved beneath the water as if it had been carefully moved from the surface to the lake bottom. The investigation into these photographs led to the discovery that Thorpe Lake had been the site of numerous disappearances over the past century. Homesteaders, trappers, Native American families, tourists, and researchers had vanished near the lake with disturbing regularity. When their names were compiled and cross-referenced with the faces visible in Emma's final photographs, matches were found for more than 30 missing persons cases dating back to the 1920s. The implications were staggering. Thorpe Lake was somehow home to an underwater community of people who had disappeared over the course of nearly a century. They had adapted to underwater life in ways that defied medical science, creating a society beneath the surface that existed parallel to the world above. The official investigation was classified immediately after these discoveries, and all evidence was sealed under national security protocols. The lake was declared off-limits to civilian access, with a security perimeter established to prevent further disappearances. Dr. Walsh's satellite data was confiscated, and all team members involved in the recovery operation were required to sign confidentiality agreements that prevented them from discussing what they had witnessed. But the lake itself couldn't be contained or controlled. Satellite monitoring continued, and the thermal signatures returned within days of the Monroe family's removal. New heat sources appeared beneath the surface, moving in the same patterns, following the same nightly routines. The lake had reclaimed whatever force or presence had sustained the underwater community, and it continued to call to those who came too close to its shores. I was permitted to maintain copies of the photographic evidence and certain medical records, presumably because my years of investigation had already made me a repository for information about the case that officials couldn't easily suppress. But I was warned that publishing specific details about the recovery operation or the medical findings could result in federal prosecution. What I can share is the conclusion that haunts me. Thorpe Lake is not simply a body of water. It's something far more complex and dangerous, a place where the normal rules of life and death don't apply. The people who disappear there don't die in any conventional sense. They're transformed, adapted to an underwater existence that allows them to continue living in ways that challenge our understanding of human biology. The Monroe family chose this transformation, according to the evidence in Sarah's journal and Emma's photographs. They heard the calls from beneath the lake and decided to answer them, to join whatever community existed in the dark water below. Theodore Brennan had made the same choice decades earlier, and dozens of others had chosen similarly over the course of a century. But the question that keeps me awake at night is whether all of these people chose their fate willingly, or whether something beneath Thorpe Lake has the power to compel such choices, to make disappearing into dark water seem like the most reasonable decision in the world. The satellite monitoring continues to this day, and the thermal signatures continue their nightly movements beneath the ice. Every March, on the anniversary of the Monroe disappearance, the patterns change slightly, becoming more active, as if the underwater community is celebrating or commemorating something. And every year, people continue to disappear near remote lakes throughout Alaska, people who hear voices calling from the water and decide to answer them. The Monroe family's story ended with their dissolution in the sunlight, but their legacy lives on in the questions they left behind. What really exists beneath the surface of Thorpe Lake? How many other bodies of water harbor similar communities of the disappeared? And most troubling of all, how many of us hearing those voices calling from the dark water would have the strength to walk away? The official files remain sealed, but the mystery continues to grow. Every expedition to remote Alaskan lakes brings back reports of thermal anomalies, underwater structures, and voices that seem to call from the depths. The Monroe case was just the beginning of a larger pattern that extends far beyond one family's vacation that went wrong. As I finish writing this account, I can't help but think about Emma's final photograph, the one that showed dozens of people living contentedly beneath the water. They looked happy in a way that surface dwellers rarely achieve, connected to something larger than themselves, part of a community that had transcended the normal limitations of human existence. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if the Monroe family made the right choice. In a world growing more isolated and disconnected every day, perhaps there's something appealing about joining a community where everyone is forever linked, where no one is ever truly alone, where the voices that call from the dark water offer belonging instead of fear. But then I remember the way their bodies crumbled in the sunlight, the desperation in their voices as they begged to return to the water, and I know that whatever waits beneath the surface of Thorpe Lake offers a kind of life that comes at the cost of everything that makes us truly human. The lake continues to call, and people continue to answer. The pattern repeats endlessly, adding new members to the underwater community that exists in the spaces between life and death, between the world we know and the world that waits beneath the surface. What do you think really happened to the Monroe family beneath the ice at Thorpe Lake? Was their transformation into underwater dwellers a choice they made willingly, or were they compelled by forces beyond their understanding? Did they find peace in their underwater existence? Or were they trapped in a form of living death that only appeared peaceful from the surface? And most importantly, how many other families have made similar choices at remote lakes around the world, joining communities that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional human experience? Leave your theories in the comments below, and remember to subscribe for more investigations into mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about the world around us.